All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sayuri Romay, and I'm the Associate Director of Programs at the Mansfield Foundation. Thank you for joining us today for one of our Capitol Hill Asia Policy Dialogue events, or CAP events. The Mansfield Foundation's CAP series highlights leading experts and government officials so they can share their expertise and insights and provide opportunities for members of Congress and their staff to learn about these timely policy issues regarding Asia. We used to hold CAP events on Capitol Hill, but since the pandemic started, we've been online for the most part. We do hope to go back to an in-person format pretty soon. Hopefully. So please keep in touch with us. Stay tuned on our CAP series. Before we start, I want to thank our corporate friends of Mansfield who make our Capitol Hill policy dialogues possible. We're very grateful. Thank you on behalf of all of us at Mansfield, and we're delighted to see you today. So today we're going to talk about Japan's approach to improving economic security and US-Japan alignment in that area. We're joined by two wonderful speakers. Both are members of our Mansfield's US-Japan Network for the Future. And of course, our president and CEO, Frank Jannuzi, will moderate the discussion today with our two experts. So Frank, over to you to introduce the speakers.
Thanks so much, and welcome to all of our guests. The Mansfield Foundation was created by an act of Congress more than 35 years ago to perpetuate the teachings of Mike Mansfield and Maureen Mansfield, who understood that mutual understanding and cooperation could be advanced through dialogue and listening to each other. And the Foundation's mission to promote that mutual understanding and cooperation between the United States and its partners in Asia is carried out through numerous programs, including these Capitol Hill policy dialogues, which I'm very pleased to host this afternoon. It was 50 years ago this year that Mike Mansfield traveled for 2 weeks to China. Imagine sort of a 2-week CODEL by the Senate Majority Leader of the time. I can't imagine a 2-week CODEL almost anywhere in the world today, but he traveled for more than 2 weeks to China, and he saw the opportunities there awaiting China and the United States and the US-China relationship as China began its journey out of isolation of the Cultural Revolution and toward integration with the global community. 5 years later, Jimmy Carter appointed Ambassador Mansfield, Senator Mansfield, to be ambassador to Japan. And he arrived in Japan at a time of incredible trade tension, huge trade deficits. Members of Congress were bashing Toyotas on the Capitol grounds with sledgehammers. And it was a really difficult time where we were viewing Japan as an economic threat. And not just an economic threat, but really a threat to overtake the United States in global economic power and influence. And Mike Mansfield was instrumental in helping to solve that tension, in part through promoting deeper integration of the US and Japanese economies, including massive amounts of Japanese investment in the United States. 45 years later, we find ourselves with a world much transformed. It is no longer Japan that is viewed as a threat to US economic security. To the contrary, the US and Japan economies are deeply, deeply integrated, and our two nations have an alliance and a partnership rooted in shared values and in democratic norms, and shared security interests around the world, and are working as closely together as any two partners in the world, manifestly demonstrating the wisdom of Mike Mansfield's motto when he was ambassador, that the US-Japan relationship was the most important bilateral relationship in the world, bar none. But we also find ourselves confronting a much transformed China, a China which is in fact deeply integrated into the world, a China which has realized at least some of the ambitions of Mike Mansfield in adopting international norms over its 40-year journey of Gaiga Kaifang, reform and opening up. It's a China that is now the world's largest trading nation, the largest trading partner with almost all of its neighbors, a China that has undertaken massive state-owned enterprise reforms, opened its markets and its doors to foreign investment and travelers, and opened its exit doors for Chinese by the millions to travel around the world, to study, for tourism, for business. But at the same time, we see the limits of China's economic modernization and political modernization. And in recent years, we've seen China wield its economic power as a tool of its national statecraft, whether it's punishing Lotte department stores in Korea for the Korean government's deployment of THAAD anti-ballistic missile systems, or threatening to withhold strategic minerals from semiconductor and phone manufacturers in Japan or Korea or Germany over perceived slights to China's nationalist ambitions, whether they be territorial or vis-a-vis Taiwan. And there's a growing awareness in both Washington and Tokyo that while economic interdependence is a good thing and can mitigate some tensions in international relations, as we've seen today with Russia, Ukraine, sadly, it is possible for two nations with McDonald's to go to war with each other. Economic integration, economic interdependence does not trump nationalism as a driver of international affairs. And there's a requirement for the United States and its close allies to ensure adequate supply chain resiliency and independence of critical materials if we're going to feel secure and be secure in a world even as globalization and global integration may continue to progress. To help us tease through what all of this means for Japan in terms of Japan's economic tradecraft and the US-Japan alliance and relationship as we try to navigate these treacherous waters together, ensuring that we can sustain our economic and national security in a world where we no longer can have confidence that China, for instance, will be a reliable supplier of high technology that we might require for our national interests. We have two preeminent scholars. Shihoko Goto is the acting director of the Asia program and deputy director for Geoeconomics at the Wilson Center right here in Washington, D.C. She specializes in trade relations and economic issues all across the Indo-Pacific. She's expert in many areas, including energy security, but not only energy security. As Sayuri Rome mentioned, she is a member of the US-Japan Network for the Future. And prior to joining the Wilson Center, she was a financial journalist covering international political economic issues with a strong focus on Asian markets. And as a correspondent for Dow Jones News Service and the UPI, she reported on policies impacting the global financial system as well as the international trade system. Also joining us this afternoon is Kristi Govella, Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the Asia Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Dr. Govella is an expert on the intersection between economic and security policy in Asia, as well as Japanese politics and foreign policy. She's co-author, co-editor of two books. I've read one of them, Linking Trade and Security, Evolving Institutions in Asia, Europe, and the United States, and Responding to a Resurgent Russia policy and responses from the European Union and the United States. I need to read the second one in light of recent events. Dr. Govella also serves as an adjunct fellow with the East-West Center and the Pacific Forum and co-editor of the journal Asia Policy. Prior to joining the German Marshall Fund, she was assistant professor at the University of Hawaii and postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University. Shihoko, I would like you to start, if I may, and help our audience understand Japan's economic security policies and how they've been changing, and how the US and Japan are attempting to harmonize and work together to address the economic security challenges of the modern world. Over to you, Shihoko.
Great, thank you so much, Frank, and thanks to you, to Sayuri and the Mansfield Foundation for hosting this very timely discussion. And I really owe an immense deal of gratitude towards the Mansfield Foundation for being such a linchpin of bringing scholars and analysts who are focused on US-Japan relations today. The foundation plays a tremendous role, and I think we're all very grateful to be part of it. In discussing our topic for today, let me kind of start with the evolution of Japan-US economic relations, and how that is reflected in Japan's standing in the international economic order as well. Very briefly, just since the US withdrawal from CPTPP in 2017, expectations have been mounting for Japan's economic leadership in the regional order. And Tokyo has really exceeded in delivering on these expectations. It was instrumental in bringing CPTPP to the finish line. And as a mark of that trade agreement success, the biggest challenge for it now is to deal with the issue of some of the world's most competitive economies to join. That is to say the UK, China, Taiwan, and South Korea. And as the biggest economy of the 11 member states, Japan now finds itself in a leadership role of steering one of the biggest challenges facing the political economy of the Indo-Pacific. That is to say, how and whether to include China in a framework that espouses values of post-war international liberal order that has been championed by the United States, even though the United States is not part of it. So we know that Japan has evolved over the decades from being seen as a rule breaker to then becoming a rule maker. And now the question is, can it become a kingmaker of the regional economic order? We also know that tariff reductions and market access are no longer the biggest issues on the trade front, especially amongst industrial nations. Instead, the focus is very much on addressing economic security and promoting collective interests for resilience, especially in the face of growing economic nationalism in democracies. And as we can see from the success of CPTPP and RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Framework, trade has actually been a binding force to bring the disparate countries of the Indo-Pacific together, from which different forms of governance, economic development, industrial bases can actually work together for a common goal. And with trade deficits no longer an issue of contention, trade has actually emerged as a unifying force for US-Japan relations as well in defining shared goals. And clearly, on the economic security front, there are many shared interests between Japan and the United States. Tokyo and Washington have certainly learned similar lessons from the pandemic, including identifying key sectors that are vulnerable to geopolitical risks and disruptions, most notably in the semiconductor industry. They share a common understanding of the need to reassess supply chains and not simply focus on cost performance, but also on resilience as well, to balance the drive to reshore and nearshore critical industries and boost economic partnerships with like-minded countries, especially in the technology sector. And I know Kristi will discuss the content of the Japan's economic security legislation, which was presented last week at length. But let me just say that Japan's domestic economic security legislation is not without its critics within Japan. And in particular, concern about the economic security law being pushed through before the broader national defense strategy has been put in place has raised eyebrows, almost like putting the cart before the horse. And many have argued that it doesn't really make sense that economic security strategy came before the broader roadmap. The critics would say that if Tokyo really wanted to look at the defense and military security concerns from the perspective of economic security, the more effective way would have been to actually focus on the defense needs and capabilities. That is to say, what kind of military technologies actually need to be invested in, and then only after that develop an economic strategy. There is concern too that the security concerns have actually been used or manipulated as a means to justify spending on select industries, including the semiconductor industry, in which Japan had actually been a leader in until the 1980s, for the broader goal of economic revitalization, rather than boosting military security as such. Those arguments are not without merit, but there is greater consensus that we are now entering what will be a long drawn out systemic confrontation to compete with China and to seek if there are off-ramps for cooperation with Beijing. That will require not just more coordination with like-minded countries, but it will require more flexibility and more strategic positioning. And disruptions caused by COVID have exposed the vulnerabilities of the current regional economic landscape. And they have undoubtedly accelerated the impetus for Japan-US economic cooperation, especially to promote and protect critical technologies in the face of Chinese competition. We've already seen those channels for cooperation expand through the Quad, as well as through the G7, and the commitment for further bilateral cooperation between the United States and Japan is expected with the 2+2 economic dialogue moving forward. And within Tokyo, there is a sense of relief that the United States has become more closely aligned with how Japan views China as an economic competitor and a destabilizer of the regional order. But looking ahead, there is also an underlying concern repeatedly voiced by US government officials, especially about the vulnerabilities of Japanese technology security and data security between the Japanese government agencies and Japanese industries. Concerns about Japan's security vulnerabilities have certainly been raised, even as the possibility of Japan being considered to join the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance with Australia, New Zealand, the United States, the UK, and Canada. And that momentum is on the rise in some quarters. But with data and security becoming a key factor in determining economic as well as security partnerships, the need for Japan to bolster its own intelligence systems to not only contribute to intelligence gathering, but also secure state secrets is now imperative. For Japan to advance its own economic security interests, it does need to step up efforts to be more fully integrated in the highest intelligence community, which will require fuller domestic debate on going beyond the 2013 Act to protect specially designated secrets so that it can be an active and trusted intelligence partner. Another requirement will be a reassessment of technology cooperation and information sharing between public and private sectors, and how to beef up Japan's own defense technology capabilities and defense industrial base in the longer term. And these are issues for debate that go far beyond that of pure economic policy. Finally, I do want to make one brief comment on the other economic pillar of the Kishida government. The Japanese Prime Minister, who came into office last October, has focused both on economic security as well as promoting new capitalism. And as both Japan and the United States look to promote domestic growth, balancing economic security needs and addressing the growing voices of economic nationalism and populism will remain a fundamental challenge. For Prime Minister Kishida, he is finding a solution to that conundrum through his vision of new capitalism. It is a vision that reimagines Japan's economic future fundamentally and is certainly ambitious in its goals. His objective isn't simply about raising Japan's GDP, but the bigger goal, the objective is really to lead the world in how it reimagines economic values. That is the bigger goal, but when we start looking at the specific policy prescriptions, they aren't necessarily all that revolutionary. It does call for issues like increasing wages, fostering innovation, reducing carbon emissions, but perhaps most importantly, restoring confidence in democracy as a model for growth that benefits the nation at large and to reduce the income gap. New capitalism also focuses on bolstering support for good governance and democratic values as a way forward for growth. And that is certainly in line with the Biden administration's values. And so we know that there are elements of new capitalism that work well with the White House's own domestic growth strategy. We know too that the soon-to-be launched Biden administration, as the Biden administration prepares the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which will be launched soon, the ideas that are being discussed in advance, such as the focus on supply chain resilience, infrastructure development, environmental sustainability, and ensuring free trade, these are ripe for bilateral cooperation. But we do need to bear in mind that the United States is not going to be joining the CPTPP anytime soon, and the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework itself will not be increasing access to US markets. And the latest USTR strategic plan that was unveiled earlier this week for the 2022 to 2026 period is particularly notable for focusing on equity, such as inclusive and durable trade policies that benefit all workers. So where we are today is that both Japan and the United States are on the same page when it comes to defining the challenges and the need for greater economic security, and they're moving forward in the same directions. But more adjustments need to be made to boost trust that is fundamental for economic as well as defense cooperation. But as vibrant democracies, both are also facing a greater need to address growing inequities and growing frustrations with the current economic systems. And balancing the needs of economic security and meeting domestic economic needs will require continued close cooperation and coordination, which may or may not be possible in this current political climate in both countries. So let me leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much, Shihoko. You have introduced for us several concepts. The new capitalism. There's certainly a debate underway in this country about how capitalism works and whether it delivers the kinds of benefits broadly across society that are necessary and desired in our country. I think President Biden's election itself was rooted in a kind of a dedication to new capitalism to try to ensure that workers would profit alongside corporate CEOs. But delivering on those promises is a tricky task. You've spoken of trade as a unifying force and a binding agent, as it can be between the US and Japan, for instance, and between the US and other trading partners. But you've also spoken to a growing economic nationalism and the fact that both in the United States, as we heard in the State of the Union, with a very strong commitment by the president to buy America, but also as we're going to hear from Kristi, as Japan ponders its own new capitalist vision and how to deliver for the Japanese people on the promises of the Kishida administration. There's also an emphasis there on ensuring that Japan itself prospers and not only just integration with the world for global interests. And finally, Shihoko, you've raised an important practical question about the extent to which US-Japan economic security integration may be limited or affected by the amount of trust the US has in Japan in areas such as cybersecurity or national security, vetting of protection of sensitive information. All of this affects the ability of the US to integrate as deeply with Japan as might be otherwise desirable. And finally, you also put on the table the question of CPTPP. However much integration the US wants to have with Japan, we can't quite seem to bring ourselves to join this trading bloc. And I hope we'll get into that in the Q&A as well. Dr. Govella, over to you, please, for your analysis of the situation with a special Japanese sort of perspective and deeper into what the Japanese are actually doing in their legislation to shape their economic security future.
Thank you, Frank, and thanks to the Mansfield Foundation for having me here today and for all of the wonderful work that you do. So, I want to underscore a lot of the points that Shihoko made about outlining the greater context, and perhaps emphasize even more so that Japan really does see itself as having been at the front lines of dealing with some of these economic security challenges, whereas some other countries, including the US, have come to recognize the vulnerabilities that can come with interdependence relatively recently. Japan really had been thinking about this with respect to China since for the last 10 or 15 years, due to various incidents in the Senkakus and other tensions, and so in some ways, Japan provides an instructive example of the kinds of policies that can be taken, and also, some instructive examples of the limitations of those policies and how, you can't necessarily mitigate risk to the extent that you might like. So as Shihoko mentioned, concerns about Chinese dominance and use of economic coercion, changes in technology and the pandemic, these three things really have led many countries, including the US and Japan, to recognize these vulnerabilities more so. So it's worth noting, though, that there really is not a single definition of economic security. And I think even in the discussion today, you can tell that it's a very multidimensional concept. It's one that's being defined right now by countries and companies and scholars around the world. And it can be quite expansive. So, for example, the US Department of Defense defines economic security as the ability to protect or advance US economic interests, shape international interests to American liking, and possess material resources to fend off non-economic challenges. So there's a lot there, right? It's partly about prosperity, about defense, about, proactively shaping the world. And so it's really important that we talk about this because, this is a concept that is contested, and it's not just an academic issue. It has real implications for policy. And I think some of the concerns that you hear, for example, from the private sector or from other countries are really about the ambiguousness of, how countries are defining economic security, and concerns that, talk about economic security is really a code word for protectionism or other kinds of things, right? So I think it's a really interesting time to be examining this. So as Shihoko already kind of previewed, there's a lot of alignment between Japan and the US. It's definitely not like it was in the age of trade tensions between the two countries. But the question now is really, how do the two countries move past sort of a mutual recognition of the problems and challenges, or what some people have called admiring the problem, right, to actually deal with the problems or solve problems, and how quickly and effectively can they do so? And it's not just Japan and the US, it's also countries all around the world that are really trying to develop toolkits to more effectively cope with economic coercion and to deploy economic statecraft, which I'm sure is a term many people have heard, but is essentially the use of economic tools for non-economic purposes very broadly. And you can try to think about some of these tools as perhaps being more defensive and some being more proactive, but those lines are really rather blurry. And, when we talk about tools, we're talking about things like trade, imports, exports, investments, sanctions, which we've been hearing a lot about in the news lately, aid, financial policy, tourism, all of these things are connections that can be weaponized in various ways. They can also be used to develop good relationships or used as positive incentives. And so we've really, come to appreciate the breadth of these tools. So, to focus in on the discussion of Japan and potential cooperation with the US, I basically just want to focus on two main things. One is domestic tools, and just talking a bit about some of the ones that are in development. And then the second is more outward looking. We can think of these as foreign policy instruments or, attempts to cooperate with the US and other countries. So domestically, again, Japan has been thinking about these issues for a while. And so it's been creating a lot of different, institutions within the government to think about economic security. It's been, tightening rules on investment screening, just like the US and Europe have been. It's been thinking about research and development. It created a new ministerial post for economic security, for example. So, all these changes have been coming. And then, as was mentioned, everybody is watching this economic security legislation that was approved by the cabinet on February 25th. And this really is, again, considered to be a sort of set of domestic tools that can help Japan to cope with some of the concerns that have already been discussed. It has, as far as we are understanding, four main pillars. One is strengthening of key infrastructure. So we talk about this as critical infrastructure, things like major utilities, telecoms, et cetera. And, some of the provisions, for example, would require Japanese operators of this kind of critical infrastructure to get government approval when they procure equipment, basically mainly to protect those systems from cyber attacks. And this is mainly inspired by concerns about, Chinese involvement in Chinese products, for example. The second main pillar is reinforcing supply chain stability, and supply chains have just been, in the middle of every domestic and international economic discussion recently, so it's not surprising. But typical suspects such as semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, critical minerals, et cetera, are thought to be included. And so, for example, companies in these sectors may be eligible for government subsidies, or there may be other kinds of support for that. The third pillar is facilitating public-private cooperation on developing cutting-edge technology, which again includes some, mentions of funding, et cetera. And the fourth pillar is keeping patents on sensitive technologies secret. And this brings Japan into closer alignment with countries like the US that have processes for this. But for example, particularly with technologies that have potential military applications, such as those related to nuclear weapons development or quantum technology, the government will actually compensate companies and applicants for foregone licensing income because those patents would be deemed a national security risk if they were made public. And so, basically there will be this attempt to try to protect information and also to heighten penalties and punishments if you leak it. So, this is, again, a domestic tool, but one that is, done with an eye towards facilitating cooperation with the US and with others. Shihoko already mentioned some of the concerns about sort of the sequencing of the law. I would just add that, it will take time to implement. A lot of people think that it lacks important details. On the private sector side, there is, of course, understandable concern about too much government intervention and messing with competitiveness. And so again, going back to this definitional issue, companies really want the implementation to be limited as narrowly as possible to things that are really related to security. And so, that's why these things matter, because it's not quite clear, how that implementation would be coming or how it'd be interpreted. And of course, that concern from within Japan and outside about whether these kinds of tools could be used to screen out different kinds of, investment or influence the playing field in different ways. And we see the same concerns with, tools like the European Union's anti-coercion mechanism and things that they're developing to, kind of deter kinds of actions or provide stronger responses. And so it's not, uncommon. So one issue that I would raise as we move from the discussion of the domestic to more of the foreign policy tools is that, of course, again, Japan is not the only country implementing this kind of domestic legislation or taking these actions. So really, it raises a question of, how can you coordinate these policies, both to make sure that they don't contain loopholes so that, problematic actors don't just run out of one domestic arena into another. How do you really also effectively target, the real concerns and not depress, legitimate investment? And so it's really an issue of harmonization, right, and coordination, and making sure that as these new rules, which again are very new in some cases they have precedence, in others, countries are being more innovative, but it really requires a discussion between like-minded partners like the US and Japan about how you're thinking about this, not only in cooperating with each other, but also in making sure your domestic systems are, compatible in some way. So that brings me to my second outward-facing efforts. I won't talk very much about Japan's more unilateral efforts to, for example, encourage Japanese companies to come bring their production home through subsidies, et cetera. I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A if people are interested. But, I'll focus mostly on bilateral and also minilateral cooperation, again, focused on the US and Japan, but I think they're very closely tied together. So we've already heard, the words like ally shoring and friendshoring in this discussion, but there's beyond, issues of production relocation and things. There's a lot of agreement of what the problems are and desire to cooperate. And so, for example, last year we saw the US and Japan establish the US-Japan Competitiveness and Resilience Partnership, or the CORE partnership. And that really does include a lot of issues for cooperation that we've already mentioned in this discussion, such as, cooperation on competitiveness and innovation, technologies such as 5G and next generation mobile networks, ICT standards, supply chains, of course, biotech, and also cooperating in third countries to, for example, build cyber capacity in other places that are key. So there's also, of course, portions of that partnership on health and climate that also relate to economic security and that also tie into the development of new technologies or securing supply chains. And then we see, as that partnership was announced, we see more concrete efforts to bring that forward. For example, METI and the Department of Commerce established the US-Japan Commercial and Industrial Partnership, which really takes that to the private sectors and tries to initiate activities that promote investment and cooperation between the two countries. And again, we hear, familiar industries mentioned, such as semiconductors, 5G, et cetera. So, this is one basket of bilateral cooperation that is moving forward and that is trying to add substance and solutions to the concerns. Of course, they're very complex ones. And then I think more broadly, the US and Japan are both thinking of their bilateral cooperation as a major plank of minilateral and broader cooperation. So for example, we see echoes of what I just mentioned in the Quad and its focus on critical and emerging technologies. Again, many similar industries mentioned. We also see talk about cooperation on infrastructure investment in many of these venues, which of course is driven by concerns about the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative and their practices and standards across the world, but also in the region. And then of course there are other minilateral mechanisms like trilateral cooperation between the US, Japan, and Australia on infrastructure, on different kinds of things. So I think that there is a lot of opportunity for alignment and cooperation, and really the US-Japan relationship serves as sort of a core from which they can build out and discuss these issues because, as I said, they are going on all over the world, but trying to sort it out with all your partners at once can sometimes be somewhat complicated. So, I think there is that, that knowledge that the US-Japan relationship is a place from which one can logically start. So just to conclude, I would say that I'm talking about the different kinds of things that are being done, but these things are not without their critics. There are a lot of different, tensions and issues that need to be considered. And, it's pretty difficult actually to solve the kinds of vulnerabilities. You can mitigate risk, but it's a slow process. It takes time. And, most of the time, these are private sector actors that you're trying to influence to do things. And so it's not an automatic, kind of process of readjustment or, moving production, et cetera. So, of course, we see in some cases limited or very slow effects. And so we can also discuss that if people like. But, just to close up, you have to balance, for example, the desire to strengthen your domestic economy versus the need to cooperate with other countries. You have to balance your need for defensive measures and the need to maintain economic openness so people can invest. You need to balance the role of the government and the private sector. And then, also figure out how much does it make sense to cooperate and where is the role of normal economic competition, in all of this. So it's a very complicated basket of issues, but this toolkit is attempting to, give countries a better ability to cope with the problems that have become increasingly obvious.
Thank you, Dr. Govella. I'm struck by the irony of the term, cooperation on competitiveness. And I think you touched on it there at the end, that for Japan and the United States, while they seek refuge in each other, sort of the allied shoring, the attempt to build resilient supply chains in critical areas like semiconductors with each other. They also have tensions in terms of maintaining domestic national competitiveness. And so it's not yet the case that the US and Japan would be all in for each other. And that there's a seeking of harmonization on these critical supply chain and economic security issues, a common approach, a common prioritization, but it doesn't mean that either nation is prepared to abandon the competitive fight with each other to be in the lead on AI or quantum computing. So I guess my question is, I'm going to put on my former congressional staffer hat when I was a staffer for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and ask both of you to imagine that you are advising, the U.S. Congress on how to strike that balance that Kristi was getting at between things like Buy America, where we want to ensure that our critical infrastructure investments also benefit American workers and American companies, against the need to also open up procurement, have cross-licensing, have harmonization of standards with close allies like Japan, so as to seek mutual benefit. The Mansfield Foundation for the last 7 years has been running a US-Japan Space Forum. And among the things we've been trying to address are issues of procurement standards and the ability of Japanese space industries to bid on NASA projects like for Artemis or for the space station, and vice versa. There are certain fields where such cooperation and cross-licensing is clearly economically beneficial. And yet it does involve some sacrifice in terms of essentially acknowledging that Japan might do some things better than we do, and we're going to do some things better than Japan does. But so if you're a congressional staffer and you're trying to address and promote this cooperation with a close partner like Japan to enhance our mutual economic security, how do you strike that balance? And can you be assured that the Japanese are going to reciprocate? In other words, if we open up our markets, if we allow Toshiba and Hitachi and Panasonic to bid on American cybersecurity projects at home, are they going to do the same in Japan and allow Microsoft and Amazon Web Services to be opening up the Japanese markets? What's your assessment about how to strike that balance? Let me ask Shihoko to start.
Yeah, it's a very complicated question, but when we talk about terminology, one of the issues of this is going to be about changing the definition of market access, right? It used to be when Japan was selling cars, there was a quota for X amount of cars, and then America actually started saying it was per by price. So Japan actually enhanced its own technology for cars, started selling fewer cars, but higher quality cars that actually brought more bang to the buck. And it actually backfired in actually leading to a decline in the US auto industry. So market access today really is about how it's making sure that the Japanese companies, when investing in the United States, are not just up to date, but actually also have a pulse on where the US Congress and legislators are thinking of when they actually define security. So on the one hand, we have this very high level cooperation talking about ideologies, strategic interests, competition with China. But if you are a company that is part of a supplier to provide facial recognition technology, you have to be very well aware of what some of the criterion of what the standards of security are. If I were a member of Congress, I would really, in addition to working closely together with a Japanese company so that they would invest in my particular constituency, I would also want to inform them, have more informative sessions with them about thinking about how the United States is thinking about security and strategy, and talking to them directly. And having them lobby their own Japanese government to ensure that there is this lobbying between the two governments. So it's not simply a top-down negotiation, but you actually have a bottom-up about transparency and clarity on what it is that security considerations are.
Thank you, Shihoko. Kristi?
Sure. Of course, that's a very complicated question, as I sort of ended my remarks with. But I mean, I think, just with the caveats that I think it depends pretty strongly on the industry and sector, because there are very different dynamics in some of these different areas that we're talking about. The devil's really in the details, right? Because to some extent, domestic promotion and cooperation are very compatible. And especially when the concern is that China is too dominant, for example, as you're trying to basically reduce your dependence by both bolstering your domestic strength and shoring up your relationships with like-minded partners, there's going to be a certain amount of that will be easier as you're sort of taking that dominance away from China. But then as it becomes more competitive, that's where the questions arise. So I think that trust is a big factor, but you can always sequence the way you do agreements. You can try to find ways to make things relatively equitable and have some binding kinds of agreements. But there's always a risk in these kinds of things. And if market dynamics change, then the conversation can change very quickly. But if I was, a member of Congress, I think that in the current conversations, you see them, emphasizing the domestic benefits, from investment, and also, just emphasizing that the resilience of these things is also important for, things like consumers, for other reasons, et cetera. And so, there are kind of many aims you're trying to achieve, and that, it's not necessarily the case that it's a zero-sum game between the domestic and the international or the cooperation with partners, but there are actually, reasons why, for example, even if you could bring your production 100% home, that wouldn't actually be a good result because it would create other kinds of vulnerabilities. It would create other kinds of problems, right? So I think, the more that conversation can be nuanced and kind of, portrayed in not maybe the most complex way, but then, in a way which at least demonstrates this is not as simple as, if somebody else has it, then we don't. It's really, more of there is positive some aspects to it.
Thank you both. Question from the audience about the digital economy. Both of you have touched on the digital economy as an area both for integration, but also where there's challenges to harmonization. And the specific question goes to the regional agreements, such as the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement. Would it be easier, Terence Matsuo asks, for both the Japan and American governments to join an existing agreement, or should we be working towards a new, updated digital economic partnership agreements? I think this is something that USTR is looking at in terms of how to, in the absence of big international trade agreements per se, how nonetheless to modernize our trade infrastructure to accommodate the digital era. Can either of you address Terence's question?
I can go first. Japan's deepest wish to this day is for Washington to join the CPTPP, and within that framework, have the digital trade discussion, to have the standardization, harmonization of digital trade regulations and rules. That, under the current political climate, as you know very well, Frank, is unlikely to happen. And what we see from the expectant Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is that the White House is trying to come up with a new way. So they promote it as something as, a revolutionary way of engaging in trade and ensuring U.S. Interests in this trade sphere. And digital trade is definitely something that the White House is trying to promote because if nothing else, this is the area where the United States is the single dominant player, and it does have a vested interest in ensuring that it is part of the rule-making process and not just part of the rule-following process. When it is the economic framework that is about to be launched, the expectation is that it will be an a la carte type of proposal, so that countries can actually sign on to specific issues. I think countries like Japan, Australia, South Korea, some of these other key players will probably sign on to what the United States would propose. But there will be others that will find it very difficult to sign on to it. And so this is going to be the dilemma for the United States. On the one hand, it can actually promote its own interests, but the core number and the legitimacy, essentially, of what it is espousing will not necessarily be embraced by a larger grouping of countries. If it joined the CPTPP, it would be a much more effective way to do so.
Thanks. Let me move on to another question, which gets to an asymmetry between the United States and Japan with respect to alliance relationships. As we've seen recently in Europe, where the United States with NATO partners have moved multilaterally to respond to Russian aggression against Ukraine. The United States is very comfortable working with and leading large multilateral alliance structures. And we have dozens of allied nations around the world. Japan has one, the United States, one ally. Traditionally, Japan has had some challenge, whether it comes to issues like security cooperation and arms sales, or intelligence sharing and information sharing, with anything outside of that US-Japan bilateral channel. And yet, the challenges with both, which both of you have identified, to the economic security of the United States and Japan are by nature multilateral. And the solutions to them are at least minilateral and acknowledged to be as such, whether it's through the Quad or other structures where the United States is trying to promote a multilateral discussion about how we address the challenges from China or Russia with respect to supply chain and technology controls. So a long lead in to what I hope is a relatively straightforward question, which is how can Japan and the US square the circle of Japan's high level of comfort working bilaterally with the US, but relative discomfort trying to multilateralize such security cooperation or cooperation in strategic technologies? You know, is this something that Japan is going to get over? Is the Kishida government and modern Japan from Abe onward the kind of government that can gradually shed its reluctance to enmesh itself more in multilateral or minilateral regimes to help address issues like economic resiliency? Is that the trend line that we're seeing? Let me turn to you, Kristi. And there are some specific challenges. I mean, particularly about information sharing and information security and Five Eyes that Shihoko touched on. If you could maybe touch on that as well in your attempt to answer that broad question.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of different dimensions to that. So to some extent, it depends on, what kinds of cooperation we're talking about, with some being, much more difficult and others maybe being a bit easier. I mean, I think in general, despite the fact that, of course, Japan has and continues to be very focused on its relationship and alliance with the US, we've seen efforts to really build its bilateral relationships, for example, with other Quad countries to increase, different kinds of, say, joint exercises, different kinds of activities. I mean, when we talk about something like intelligence sharing, that becomes much more difficult and is difficult for, many countries to engage in, not just Japan. So, so in some sense, that's something that, by solving the bilateral problems, that is a stepping stone to it. So I think the distinguishment is probably in areas where, Japan really has to meet a certain standard to get into a grouping like Five Eyes, which would require a lot of different changes domestically and, building of trust about its practices, et cetera. But in other areas, the bar isn't to initial entry isn't that high. You can engage in, increased cooperation. You can build confidence. You can, do more with partners. I think we do see that with Japan. So, I mean, I think the alliance structure in Asia is very different inherently and for, historical reasons. And so, it's not the same for any of the countries operating in Asia as it is in, NATO, for example. And so we see now this attempt by the US, and which Japan, I think, is very much on board with, to network alliances and partnerships. There are some sticking points, for example, such as its tensions with South Korea. But, in general, it is, on board with this idea of bringing more partners and even, countries from Europe, et cetera, in ways and increasing cooperation, at least, in the spirit of it. But the details, again, are different depending on what kind of cooperation we're talking about.
Thanks, Kristi. Yes, I should credit Japan, after all, with the free and open Indo-Pacific notion, which was by definition sort of multilateral, not just rooted only in US-Japan. And to you, Shihoko, on the same question?
Yeah, I think CPTPP developing as far as it has really given greater confidence to Tokyo. It also has raised expectations for Japan to do more in the realm of not just on trade, but broader redefining the economic architecture of the region. And I think there is certainly appetite amongst the Japanese leadership, but of course, whether one is supportive of Shinzo Abe or not, there was that kind of vision that had been provided by a long-lasting administration. The Kishida government is still new. It's going to be facing an election this summer. He still has to win the confidence of the public and the government structure and the bureaucracy as well. There has been criticism of the Kishida government focusing more on the domestic issues rather than having a grand strategy for foreign policy engagement. But I think with time, assuming that this is going to be a stable and longer lasting government than the Suga government, that kind of ambition and expectation will continue. Certainly there are issues that, because we've talked a great deal about the China threat, but when you talk about it from the middle power perspective of the Indo-Pacific, there is a lot of political risk in aligning completely and depending wholeheartedly on the United States as well, because this country is also going to be facing an election and we don't know what the consequences of those will be. So in a way, Japan has no choice but to have a longer term strategic vision for itself, and it cannot do that alone, and it does need to rally like-minded countries to that end.
Thank you, Shihoko. I don't want this discussion to end without touching on the offensive side of trade, economic tradecraft, if you will. Kristi laid out the 4 pillars of Japan's economic security framework, investing in critical infrastructure, supply chain stability, public-private investments in cutting-edge tech, and addressing things like patents on sensitive technology. But we see with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the global response to it, we see also the use of economic security levers through sanctions as an attempt to shape other nations' behavior or to respond to aggression or to cut off Russian access to critical technologies that might support their military. And traditionally, Japan has been somewhat reluctant to pull that trigger. For decades, the U.S. had various kinds of export and trade restrictions on Myanmar, and Japan was reluctant to cut itself off from Myanmar that way, or it had little faith that such sanctions would significantly alter Myanmar government's behavior. But in the case of Russian aggression, we've seen a rather swift a Japanese response joining the United States in the imposition of sweeping sanctions against Russia. Can both of you just touch a little bit at the end of this show now on the use of economic tradecraft offensively and where the US and Japan are likely to go? Are we in alignment? Are we going to remain in alignment if China is the target downstream, given the disparate relationships between the US and Japan with China? Let me turn to you first, Kristi.
Sure. Just on this offensive topic, I would just make the caveat that, of course, you can also use, economic tradecraft proactively in positive ways to shape things. And I think that's definitely an opportunity for, sanctions. Certainly the kind of action that Japan has taken has been very strong in comparison to past times. I think that, not to undermine the value of the actions taken, but, one thing that has to be considered is that the level of interdependence with China is much higher, than Japan's with Russia. And so although there are certainly risks, particularly if these sanctions extend into the energy sector in a more serious way for Japan, it's not the extent to which they are integrated with China. So I think that, this is a very strong sign that Japan is willing to sign on to things. But I think there's still questions about, specific situations. And it's not only for Japan, for a lot of countries, also for the US, it would be more complicated because of this dependence with China. And also the question is, do the sanctions eventually produce their desired goal? And I think we're still seeing, how that's playing out.
Thank you, Kristi. And to you, Shihoko, anything to add?
Yeah. So the cost of Japan not falling in line with the other countries, including the United States, would have been far higher than not taking such an aggressive stance. I think in the case of Ukraine, there is this kind of almost moral clarity on which side is on the side of the good guys, and there is this international support. There is greater confidence on the part of Japan to go into that bandwagon. But at the same time, we should note that when we talk about sanctions regimes and the effectiveness of those policies actually leading to change, that's a huge debate. But at the same time, Japan still does not really pursue a values-based foreign policy to the extent that the United States has. And that is something that we need to continue to bear in mind.
Thanks. And we are about out of time, but I do want to let either of you, both of you, have any concluding thought, any final pearls of wisdom for our audience? What should they be looking for as the next signs of deeper US-Japan integration and common thinking in this area of economic security? What are the next steps that will be evidence of a deeper cooperation between the two countries?
I'll start. So I think that, I would just conclude by saying that there's a lot of movement on economic security. Countries are doing a lot. They are taking, next steps. But then, the question is sort of what is the more broad vision in the midterm or the long term for where these are going? Because right now we're starting, and so therefore more dialogue, more cooperation, more awareness. These are all great steps. But for instance, we're already starting to hear some feedback from the private sector that there are just a lot of dialogues on supply chains, and where are we supposed to go? So I mean, at some point, prioritization and focus, has to be brought to bear, and that does come with coordination. So, I think that what we see now is a lot of movement, and we should be talking about it more. We should be, talking about these contested concepts as we're defining them and kind of shape them in ways that we feel are productive. But yeah, really just keep an eye on this issue in the future, not only for the US and Japan, but also, much more broadly, globally.
Thank you, Kristi. A reminder that we can't just admire the problem. And to you, Shihoko, final thought?
Yeah, just very quickly on a more upbeat note. So the two countries really have shared security interests, and I think also they have a very shared economic value system as well, and their focus on good governance and the need to defend democracy and see that there is value added, that it is actually good for society and for their own growth trajectory is something that will continue to unite them, and their relationship will continue to be based on that of trust. And so dialogue, open communication, these are all signs of a positive, robust relationship.
Thanks so much, Shihoko. Now back to you, Sayuri, for any final thought about upcoming programming at the Mansfield Foundation. Thanks to Kristi and Shihoko for such insightful, learned, and fact-based analysis of the economic security posture of the US and Japan working individually and together. Appreciate so much your sharing your wisdom with us this afternoon. Back to you, Sayuri.
Thanks, Frank. And thank you, Shihoko and Kristi, for your insightful remarks and your answers to the audience's questions. I also want to thank the audience for joining us, and I want to remind you that our next CAP event is going to be next week, Friday, March 11th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. And we're going to talk about the elections in South Korea, which will be held next Wednesday. We'll have Dr. Mark Manning from the Congressional Research Service, who is attending today. Thanks, Mark. And Dr. Celeste Arrington, professor at George Washington University. So they're both also members of our US-Japan Network for the Future. So I pasted the registration link in the chat, and feel free to email me if you have any questions, requests, or suggestions, topic ideas, speaker ideas for our Capitol Hill Asia Policy Dialogue. I also left my email in the chat. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Thanks, panelists. Thanks, Frank. I hope to see everyone at our next CAP event next week. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon. Thank you for joining us.